Could Jesus have survived his crucifixion? For people who understand Jesus as an historical figure, there are a lot of puzzles that have to be solved in order to make sense of the historical and biblical data. Jesus was a man of history. Virtually no educated person disputes this. But what about his reappearances after his death? The disciples believed that he resurrected after he died, and that's something that the early church believed and taught. So what's a rational explanation for the reappearance of Jesus after his crucifixion? Doesn't make sense for the disciples to have stolen the body and then lied about it. They were persecuted for their faith, and as the old saying goes, liars make poor martyrs. It's unbelievably unlikely that the disciples chose to be persecuted and then executed for a lie. And clearly the tomb was found empty because, if not, all the authorities had to do was produce the body. That would have killed any claims of an empty tomb right off the bat. So how do we explain the appearances of Jesus after his death? One way of doing so is called the swoon theory. This is the belief that Jesus did not die on the cross, he merely fainted, and the Roman soldiers only thought that he had died. In some versions or variations of it, Luke the physician prepared some kind of drug or narcotic for Jesus that would have simulated his death. According to the theory, Jesus was taken down prematurely before he had truly expired. He was then placed in a tomb, and there he was able to rest and recover, and in the coolness of this enclosure, he was able to revive and then later escape. This theory doesn't account for just how lethal crucifixion really was. It was originally invented by the Persians in the 4th or 5th century BC, and then later on picked up by the Romans. First, the victim was flogged or scourged, which was designed to weaken them. The flogging was severe, and the Roman scourge dealt an incredible amount of damage to a person's back. Evidence suggests that it extended all the way from the neck and shoulders down to the backs of the thighs. It would tear away both skin and muscle, and some scholars believe that it was so severe that it could possibly leave the victim's internal organs exposed to open air. After the scourging, the victim would carry his own cross to the site of execution. Unlike reenactments today, where someone carries an entire cross, the condemned almost certainly carried only the crossbeam, which was called the patibulum. Now, upon reaching the site, the person would either have his arms tied or his hands nailed to the patibulum, and his feet would also be nailed to the cross. And of the thousands of victims from the ancient world, the remains of only one person in Israel have been definitively identified as that of someone who suffered crucifixion. This evidence consisted of a heel bone from one of the victim's feet that still had the nail embedded in it. Now, scholars have found similar physical evidence of one other person who suffered crucifixion in Roman-era Britain. Jesus would have suffered all of these things. He endured a flogging, as well as having his hands and feet pierced by nails in areas that would have caused extensive nerve damage. But we also have to consider the fact that he was given a crown of thorns. And this was much more than a little circlet that we sometimes see depicted. It probably resembled something more like a wreath or like a helmet that was then pushed down on Jesus' head. Because the scalp is so highly vascularized, this would have led to additional blood loss. But the question remains, could Jesus have survived all of this? There's one account of a person surviving crucifixion. He was one of 3 former acquaintances of the Jewish Roman historian Josephus. These 3 men were sentenced to die by the Roman authorities, and Josephus recognized them. He managed to interrupt their execution by appealing to his superiors. And the men were taken down from their crosses and given medical treatment, but only one of the 3 survived. Now, this is an example of a crucifixion that was stopped prematurely. And even then, 2 of the 3 men still died from their injuries while under a physician's care. Jesus had none of this. He suffered greater injuries than would have been expected at a typical crucifixion. Being taken down, he was then laid in a tomb with no access to doctors or medicines. And so it is supremely implausible that anyone could have survived this ordeal. For those who first concocted the swoon theory, I do appreciate their attempts to genuinely wrestle with the biblical account and to try to make sense of all of the data, which includes records of the post-execution appearances of Jesus and the importance of his death and resurrection in early Christian theology. However, it would have been impossible for anyone to survive Christ's experience, especially given the limited medical knowledge of the time. The swoon theory is a very interesting idea, but unfortunately, it just doesn't work.